Hey everybody, it is Clint. Welcome to Sweetcast. I have a vested interest in the comic book industry, and that's because I write comic books. And I want there to be a healthy industry ahead of us. So I've noticed this happening more frequently, it seems like, and that'll be established comic book pros floating an idea. They're noticing that there are some problems with the comic book industry, specifically in sales, and how that relates to creative decisions that comic book companies make. The funny thing is that many other people have been very critical of the comic book industry and the way that things have been going. So it's nice to see when the dust settles and everyone goes their own separate ways, you start to see more and more comic book pros asking these questions and maybe doing a little bit of soul searching. All right, so Jimmy Palmiotti says, serious question for people buying comics. This is not for people not buying comics that just want to see comics their way. He said for people buying comics, okay? Outside of character changes, what do you think comic companies could do to help with sales of the books, or what would make you buy more comic books each month? And he has got a lot of people replying to this with a whole bunch of suggestions. I didn't read through all of them. A lot of great suggestions. For sure, I want to give you some of mine. First off, comic books are expensive. If you're going to be buying multiple books a month, they're either going to have to be really big books, or you're buying fewer books, but they're really big. Or in order to buy actually multiple copies of books per month, I want to be able to spend $10, we'll say, and get more than 2 books. I'm going to relate this back a little bit to Magic the Gathering, because it's another hobby that I have. It's fun. I like to buy single packs sometimes, purely because it's fun to open the pack. That's it. And I realize I'm paying like $4 to get a pack and open the pack, and maybe you'll get something that is worth $4 or more, or likely you won't get anything worth anything, but you still had that experience. It was still fun. Now, for some reason, why is it that I'm willing to spend $4 on a pack of cards, but paying $4 for an entire comic book feels like a ripoff? This comes down to perceived value. If I perceive more value in that comic book, then it's going to be worth more money to me. All right. The other thing too is, if your goal is not just to get someone to buy a comic book, but for them to buy multiple comic books, I think just from a total business perspective, it might be a good idea to incentivize the purchase of more than one comic book. And again, if I relate this back to packs, a lot of stores that also sell comic books and they will sell packs of cards, you can buy 3 packs of cards for $10. And so you're getting a better deal. If you could do something, if you could incentivize something like that for comic book shops, that would be great. And what would that take? It would take more of a profit margin for comic shops to enable themselves to do that. Now, I don't know all the ins and outs here, so correct me if you own a comic book shop and you know the truth here. But I think they technically could lower the price, but that's just cutting into their own profit, right? And there's already such thin profit margins on comic books that it's very difficult to do any kind of monetary incentive to buy more than one comic as you come into the shop. Everything is just cover price. At least any comic shop that I ever go to, everything is cover price, and you take it or leave it. The other thing is dealing with the content itself. This is a tough thing, but I want to see really professional art and really professional stories. What I don't want to see is the shelves flooded from one publisher, and there's issues everywhere of anything that they can throw at the wall, because they're more worried about pushing their competition off the shelves than they are about expanding readership and getting people into the comic stores. It's this weird, selfish, like mine oh mine kind of mentality that you're just trying to choke out your competition. That's how you're going to get ahead, rather than attempting to grow readership. That is how it feels, Marvel Comics. Tell me I'm wrong. What else are you trying to do then? The constant events, once it's like you figured out that events worked in comics, then you exploit them until it becomes ridiculous. Same thing with variant covers. Once you realize that it works to sell more copies, you push it way too far. You turn the knob up to 11. You have to use some kind of discretion on all of these kinds of things. It goes overboard. So the same thing here, and Jimmy Palmiotti is pointing it out without directly saying it, but he said outside of changing character changes, changing a character, it's the same thing. I think that what happened is Marvel realized that if they changed a character or created a new woke character, that it would get a lot of attention and people would buy those books because of the novelty of it. You're going to be selling it more to normies that are not buying comic books. Remember, he said people buying comic books, but they're going to come in and scoop up those issues because it made some kind of a statement that they agree with beyond just telling a good story in comics. So I would say stop changing characters. That would be the first thing. Think about how can you tell an interesting story without changing your characters, gender, race, sexual orientation, like whatever else. Think beyond that. There's got to be something besides these superficial traits that you can dial into and make the character interesting, make the story interesting, focus on that kind of stuff. I know that sounds obvious, but that's exactly what people are wanting. All right, one more thing I want to say here. So I recently just rewatched The Lost World Jurassic Park, and I hadn't seen it in a really long time. I loved this show. I remember the first Jurassic Park came out when I was a young kid. I loved it. And then when the second one came out, I was just so stoked. I loved it as well. I ate it up. And I just loved that franchise so much. The third one, not so much. But I rewatched this one. And something that really struck me is that there was an attempt to make things equal. Equality was in mind. Diversity of not just opinions, but thoughts was in mind. And they did it in the 90s. This was 1997. They did it. Let me point out some specifics. This was refreshing, and whatever, you maybe have complaints about the movie. I rewatched it, and I thought it was a good show. But something that they did well with the character ensemble is they had characters that had different opinions. So you got this guy here, what was Eddie? No, not Ed, whatever, I forget his name. Vince Vaughn. He was like a Greenpeace member, like tree hugger kind of thing. That was the undertone. But he also like operated, like it was one component of his personality. Beyond that, he still got things done. You know what I mean? He was an asset to the team beyond just his political opinions. On the other side of the spectrum, you got this bloke here, British guy, hat that wanted to hunt down the T-Rex. Now, the funny thing is he's like with the bad guys, but he's actually one of the more rational characters in the story. He was more complicated than just being good or bad. He was a man for hire, and he was going for this big hunt. And you saw some interesting interplay between these two characters. One was sort of symbolic on the left, and one was symbolic of the right, perhaps. But it was just a very different view of the idea of preserving animals and how humankind can interact with nature, and in this case prehistoric nature. And so that was an interesting narrative you had between these two characters that interplayed that way. Okay, but then you also have the little family unit here, right? You've got Goldblum and his daughter, and what is her name? Sarah. And as an adult, I watched this and I noticed that there wasn't an attempt to subjugate the man, he was a problem. Jeff Goldblum was problematic, and so he had to be put in his place by his girlfriend and his daughter. There was no attempt to do that. There was also, it wasn't like he was the hero and he was subjugating his girlfriend. I know this all sounds so silly. But the problem is this is what has been stoking all the weirdness in comics in the past few years, because it seems symbolic of something else. But you know what they did in this movie? They gave everybody a shot and a chance to shine. I think that's how team comic books work the best. That's how, when I love the Ninja Turtles, that's how they work the best. Everybody has their chance to shine. So regardless of who's the man, who's the woman, where you as the writer sit on the political spectrum, It didn't matter. Everybody was a character in the story, and they had their moment. They all made mistakes. Every single one of them made mistakes, and every single one of them had a time to shine, including the daughter who did like gym. That was the kind of cringy part, as an adult, the gymnastics thing, kicking a raptor, whatever. I'm fine with that. We'll go with it. My point is that this really isn't that hard. It really is not. From a writing perspective, it has been done. I think that equilibrium was achieved. People got what they wanted out of the story. That's why these Jurassic Park films, they always have a younger character or characters. They have kids in them, so there's younger audiences can relate in different ways. Older audiences can relate in different ways. Ultimately, it's made for mass appeal. But if we take it back here to Jimmy Palmiotti saying outside of character changes, the reason he's bringing that up is because people insist that that's what needs to happen, that politics of the day need to be reflected in comic books, and that is going to save us all. That is not the case. It has been figured out already. How do you deal with these kinds of things? Make characters shine. Give them a moment to shine. Focus on the story and character development. Have characters that come from diverse thought backgrounds, and don't make one evil and one good. Like this was genuinely an interesting relationship between these two characters in The Lost World, because they had different perspectives on the political spectrum, and neither was some sort of straw man. You know what I mean? It treated them both fair. They each had their moment to shine. That is what I like to see in comic books. It's not that there can't be politics existing in the world. Of course they exist in the world to make it a real world, but you got to make it a little bit more complex than just, white straight man or evil, and they must be erased. You got to go beyond that. All right, so thanks for watching. I really appreciate it. Downcast, Rise and Fall. This is Downcast. 2 is on Indiegogo right now. If you haven't backed it, I think it's a great time to do so. I really appreciate the support. It is in the link in the description below. We're already at $22,848, which is fantastic. We're ahead I think $4,000 from the last campaign. So I expect definitely this campaign is going to end up doing better than the first one. So thank you if you backed it. Check it out. Like, subscribe, whatever else you want to say. Let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.